Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and again, that different introduction, that different music, and the different thumbnail attached to the podcast is because this is a specific literature series of the Career Now podcast. This is going to run throughout the summer, and I'm hoping to pull together a significant body of work, ideas, thoughts, academic analysis, and of course literature itself to stand as a resource for anyone interested in studying Korean literature or understanding it in a bit more detail. Which is why on today's podcast we have Naz Bulamur. Naz is an assistant professor in the Department of Western Languages and Literature in Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. She received her PhD in Literary Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she is the author of How Istanbul's Cultural Complexities Have Shaped 8 Contemporary Novelists, as well as the book Victorian Murderesses, The Politics of Female Violence. But on today's podcast, we're going to speak about the work she has done around Theresa Hakkun-Cha's 1982 novel, Dictee. Naz's article on the topic, which I used as research for this podcast, is going to be linked below. And the title she uses for this is Love as a Contact Zone, which is an interesting look into this complex novel. Dictee is a loose form novel. It is part poetry, part prose, part fiction, part history, part autobiography. And it is a deep dive into the world of women and the connections they have across time and space, and some of the impossibilities, some of the disconnects, and some of the tragedies of existence itself. This novel brings in the lived experience between an American Korean daughter and her Korean mother, the challenges that open up between them, but it also brings in historical figures such as Queen Min and Yu Kwon-sun, and the important role that they both held not just in the Chosun dynasty, but in the Korean independence movement. And these characters interact throughout the novel, just as they do with other historical figures such as Joan of Arc or Thérèse Martin, and with elements of Greek mythology such as that of Demeter and Persephone. This is such a complex novel that it's hard to do proper justice to, and this is why Naz's article is so important, because it's not just a look at the novel itself and a fantastic new take on how we should read the interactions there, but it is also a deep academic dive into the world of analysis, how people have seen this novel over time, how they've tried to interpret it, the mistakes they've made, the successes they've had, and the different perspectives that they've formed. And on that, this might be a good place to end the introduction. Simply because the more I speak about this novel without Naz, the more mistakes I'm likely to make. And if not that, then certainly I will do it injustice by pinching it into categories that are too small and which it doesn't fit, which it overflows from in multiple directions. And below the podcast, I'm going to link not just Naz's article on the book, but the book itself. And I do encourage listeners to go and read them for themselves and really dig into the depth and the insight that this 1982 novel offers. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media, and all the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and joining us for the second episode of the literature series, and walking through love as a contact zone in Theresa Hakkun-Cha's Dictee, this is Naz Bulamur. Naz Bulamur, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Well, welcome, Jed. Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. And today we're going to be speaking about, I suppose, a very famous Korean novel, which has much broader implications to other aspects of literature that I didn't know a lot about before reading through your article on it. And this is a really interesting book by Theresa Hakkun-Cha, and Dictee, I believe, is the title. So before we get started, give us a brief overview of this book and why it made such a big impact in the literary scene.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Actually, it did not really make much impact, unfortunately, because it's a very experimental text. It's very hard to read, and it brings together multiple different languages like French, Japanese, Korean, and none of them are translated. It brings together different genres of autobiography, fiction, poetry. So it doesn't really tell a story that has a beginning, middle, end, which the readers are often accustomed to. That nothing actually really happens. It's hard to figure out a solid meaning. So that's why unfortunately, it's a very underread novel, but I believe it's the most experimental text that I have ever read. Just to talk about the story, if you like, it tells the story of repression or how people live under dictates, but it brings together multiple means of oppression, like nationalist ideology, religion, patriarchal ideology, and it brings together many fictional and historical characters who have been suppressed under these multiple different ideologies. And these women under colonialism or, in a submissive marriage, they can't speak and they're actually broken inside. They can't express themselves. And the text actually reflects that brokenness and repression through a very much of a broken narrative in which the readers cannot really connect the its and bits together. But it's not a text maybe that for reading, but it's more about feeling. Because the more we don't understand the Korean or Japanese words, especially as a Turkish reader, the more we cannot understand who the she is, because the narrator is shifting in every chapter as well, the more we actually feel in a way how to live under colonialism. What does it feel not to be able to speak your own language, or how to live in a submissive marriage? So that experimental form very much actually reflects the content, how the characters are broken and how the form itself is broken. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yes, and throughout it, there is a thought that was pinging in my ears, reading through the book and reading through your analysis of it. That the role of the author in this, as you said, it's a very experimental book, and it runs through poetry and semi-autobiographical in places and purely novelistic in places. But the author is Korean American. And someone you have to assume is struggling, at least in part, with some of the ideas that she expresses in the book. So how much do you think the author herself is inside the novel, and her experiences are running through the women that she and the characters she creates?
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe every novel is in a way autofictional, that the novels bring some part of autobiography and fiction together. And here we see that too. As a Korean American writer, that what I know is that her parents actually, they lived in China due to Japanese occupation of Korea. And years after living in China, I think Cha and her mother immigrated to United States, where she actually attended a French Catholic school, which we see in the book too. And the unnamed mother and the unnamed daughter in the text actually, in a way, resonate with Cha and her mother herself. So in the book, we actually read how mother, for example, is in China. She's teaching in Manchuria, but although she's Korean, she's not allowed to speak Korean, but she speaks Japanese even with her Korean colleagues. That through the figure of the mother, we see how it's impossible to even speak your own language, and how it feels to be under repression. And through the daughter, which also resonates with the author herself, we in a way see how it feels to be in between multiple cultures, ethnicities, and languages. So both probably the daughter and Cha, as born in Korea, lived in China, immigrated to US with French education. We see that in betweenness and multiculturalism in the text, as, for example, suddenly we start reading French grammar exercises. And then we read about Catholic religion and the dictates at school, or how the Korean American daughter, when she actually goes back to Seoul after so many years, she doesn't feel at home in Korea either. And she doesn't feel at home in the United States as well. So she talks about how she's a multiple passport holder. She's in between these two cultures, but that there is no sense of belonging. So through that mother and daughter narrative, we actually read about a lot of historical backgrounds, that the Japanese occupation of Korea, how many people immigrated to China and then to United States. So we read about partially about Cha's life and Korean history through that narrative. But that narrative is in contact with so many other both historical and fictional characters. So that's why we can never reduce the novel into what Cha experienced due to immigration and colonialism. But there's a big part of it too. But we read about the daughter and the mother, and then we also read about, for example, Joan of Arc, for example, the French heroine and warrior who was executed. And then we read about Yu Guansun, who at the age of 19 was killed because she was starting a rebellion against the Japanese occupation. So all these different actually characters interact and connect in this highly rich and multi-layered narrative, that it's never just about Cha, but many different forms of repression and how it feels like to live under dictates, I believe.
So before we get into some of the details that you mentioned there and all those interesting characters and how they interplay, I must get you to at least give us a guidepost here for where we're heading, and the title of your article, Love as a Contact Zone. So what exactly should listeners have in their mind when you say contact zone and love as a contact zone?
Well, actually, the title Contact Zone, I borrowed this term from Mary Louise Pratt, who wrote this book titled Imperial Eyes in 1992. And actually, she defines contact zones as a social space where multiple different cultures, traditions come and clash with one another. This might be a space of colonialism or slavery or what happens aftermath. But what happens if people from multiple different ethnicities, races, ages, genders, what happens when they come and sort of form a contact under suppression or colonialism? So she defines the term as a zone of conflict too, but a contact actually. So here, I mean, there are multiple contact zones. I believe that first of all, these women from multiple different nationalities come together. That for example, this 19-year-old Gwansun is Korean, and she rebels against the Japanese in 1919. But in 1919, she calls the name of Joan of Arc, for example. And the moment she calls the name of Joan of Arc, who is a French warrior who lived between 1412 and 1431, then this repressed woman in actually Korea is in contact with Joan of Arc, who was a French heroine, but who was executed allegedly for being cross-dressing and joining the army, and nobody cared about her really national sacrifices, and she fought against the British with and protected her country. But when they call each other's name, in a way, that contact zone between the women shows that women have always been repressed from the 15th century to the 19th century, that they're not allowed to be heroines and fight, that martyrdom and heroism have always been more male discourses. So when they call each other's name, both the France and Korea connect, 15th century and 19th century connect, and through that connection that the text shows nothing has changed. That maybe we actually tell men to go and die for their countries and we glorify them as martyrs. But when women like Gwansun actually suppress their domestic roles, that they're actually punished. And so that in a way becomes a contact zone, you know, and they also connect with the daughter and the mother who live in China due to Japanese occupation as well. So it's like bringing together these multiple characters, connecting multiple repressions and dictates. And that's what the contact zone part is. And why love is a contact zone, that I argue in this article, as many writers have previously said, that love is a very social, political emotion, that we are always told who we are supposed to love and what we're supposed to love. And these multiple different characters, named and unnamed, they connect, I argue, that through their, let's say, love for Jesus, or love for the nation, like Joan of Arc and Guan, or through, let's say, maternal love, or through their love for the husbands. But other than the maternal love, I feel that in this text it shows how these different kinds of love have been, in a way, dictated by societies. And it's true that sort of a socially constructed feeling that they come together.
So let's talk about some of those layers of love and that nationalism that you spoke about, because that was really an interesting phenomena that you mentioned here. And it in a way, it excludes women from nationality itself, the idea that they can never be martyrs, they can never be the builders of the nation. And another person who comes through in the text, though, is the Korean Queen Min of Korea. And she was, of course, the queen during the end of the Chosun dynasty. And there's a really interesting literary choice that the author makes here. She makes Queen Min alive well past her death, so during the 1919 Korean uprising, and she makes her a central figure. So I might get to explain again through that lens who Queen Min was, but also why the author makes this change and this move through time and space and has her alive and fighting for Korean independence during Japanese colonization.
Well, I'll also connect that question with your earlier question. That's why I'm so much interested in the text, because every time I read this, I see something different, and it makes me think differently. And the first time I read the text, and there's a sentence actually which says, in Gwansun's 16th year, the conspiracy by the Japanese to overthrow the Korean government is achieved with the assassination of the ruling Queen Min. So actually, I when I first read this, I thought, well, after Queen Min was assassinated, Gwansun actually decided to, revolt against the Japanese. But then I actually figured out that there's so much of a time space between them, that Queen Min of Chosun dynasty died in 1895. And actually, in what I read, she was not content with her traditional subservient role. And her father-in-law, this Hung-son, he actually hoped to maintain his power by marrying his child king's son to an orphan wife, who is Queen Min. And but actually, as an orphan, Queen Min, the queen, she had the opportunity to educate herself without an authoritative father figure, and she actually went against her domestic roles, and she wanted to protect Korea against the Japanese threat. And of course, she was assassinated. So we have one figure, a powerful female figure, who was assassinated in 1895, and text connects that assassination with 1919, when Gwansun dies, because she too, like Queen Min, rebels against the Japanese. And by playing with this time and space, I believe, by connecting 1895 with 1919, I think the text is in a way rewriting Korean history, because throughout the text there is also the hint that the history has always been his story, that Korean history has been written predominantly by men, And when Japanese occupied Korea, they actually, as far as I read, burned many books, and they rewrote Korean history from their lens. And in many pages, we read that nobody actually cared about Gwansun because she was a young girl, and nobody wanted her to be actively involved in these demonstrations. So by connecting these two dates, and in a way, the text makes Queen Min and Gwansun these heroines in history. We always read the heroes and their achievements, and that's what the epic is about. But here, it's actually instead we read about these achievements of women, and the text actually gives voice to these women. So the causality actually changes. It's the Queen Min's assassination leads to Gwansun's reaction against the Japanese. So by this imagining a more asymmetrical view of time, that she brings out, I think, the women's voice and shows how women too inspired national consciousness, how women too were actively involved in these revolts. And there are these uncaptioned photographs in the text too of women actually protesting. We don't know what they're protesting against, but they're very much actively involved.
And that, as you're saying that, it was pinging in my ear, the idea of this, I suppose, a shifting of national identity that seems to come through a lot of the text here in so many ways. As you mentioned there, Yu Kwang-sun is one of these great freedom fighters through the novel, and at the same time, the patriarch around her wishing that she wasn't such. They wish that she wasn't out there fighting for their own nationalism. It's almost like a discord and a break between what their desires are and what their desires for feminine ideals to be at the same time. So I wonder how you see this disconnect running throughout some of the text, or whether I'm misreading this in some way.
Well, I mean, that she not only connects with Queen Min again to, in a way, rewrite the whole Korean history, but she also actually, in the text, she calls the name of Joan of Arc 3 times, which is also interesting because, as far as I read, France also actually occupied Korea, and they tried to impose their religion and so on. So that the text connects Korea with the country that invaded it at some point. And because normally in some texts there are very clear-cut binary oppositions between oppressor and the oppressed, that we see, let's say, France, let's say the West as the oppressor and the East, Asia, as the oppressed. But the text is breaking that binary actually by showing how Joan of Arc too was suppressed, that not only in Korea, in France, it was not appropriate for women, let's say, to join the 100 years of war and, be heroic and brave. That although she actually helped lift the British siege at Orleans in 9 days, that she was a brave woman warrior, that actually she was executed for heresy compounded by cross-dressing. And so that there's suppression in France too, that whether it's France, Korea, whether it's 14th century or 19th century, that there are always different forms of oppression that the text actually shows. And it's also very interesting that in the text we see a still of the actress playing the role of Joan of Arc in a French silent movie. Now I can't remember the name, but it's an uncaptioned actually photograph of the actress Renée Falconetti, I think, playing the role of Joan of Arc. And but we see that sadness, repression, or some sort of religious yearning in her face. So even though we don't know who that person is, it's an uncaptioned photograph, the photo tells us those the themes of sadness, repression, and devotion. But again, it's another contact zone, and which that the love for the nation actually has very much suppressed them, because in terms of loving the nation, the women are supposed to be sacrificing their sons or husbands to war, but they're never are supposed to go to war and fight. That it's been against their gender roles for many years in many cultures.
So as we speak about nationalistic love and patriotic love, it is important, I suppose, to mention at this point what the novel is not. And you write that it is not a novel based around nation building that promotes self-sacrifice for national unity. In fact, at some points throughout the novel, it goes out of its way to point out the futility of creating such a unified project. So I might get to take us there for a moment. We spoke a lot about this idea of fighting for national identity, but many Koreans often have this feeling in their minds that national identity, at least today, is about nation building and economic strength and unity. And this novel is offering a very different view of that.
Yes. So on the one hand, the novel is again rewriting history through the point of view of women, and by foregrounding the women's accomplishments. So that's why the Joan of Arc, Queen Min, and Gwansun, they connect with one another. But while actually showing, how women too can be warriors, and how they too can be brave, or how history should be written maybe to show the accomplishments of women, that the novel refrains from being a nationalist text. So the novel is not encouraging the readers at all to go and fight for their nations and sacrifice their lives. And that there is this semi-poem actually that asks, how would you even define nationality? The poem says, does it relate to blood, or ancestry, or race, or lineage? And the poem says that these categories of nation, blood, that they don't mean much, that we are multiple and plural, and we can be in between multiple cultures. So it's the text as a whole, it doesn't inspire any national love. That so it doesn't aspire the patriotic love at all. But it shows again how history has predominantly written by men to foreground the achievements of men. Indeed, there is an epic chapter, and epic is all about celebrating the deeds of heroes. So it rewrites the history. It shows the women's accomplishments of what they have done for the love of nation, but it is not actually sustaining that patriotic love at all. And that's why the text is very broken too. If it actually endorsed patriotic love, then it would have been a very classical novel with beginning, middle, end, characters fighting for their nations, and rewarded at the end with nice, let's say, relationships or money or power. But it's not like that. That the fragmentation actually, the disunity is totally going against any category of nation or ethnicity.
Well, let's introduce another one of those fragments then. And this is the entrance of a French Catholic nun. And this is in a section about a love again, but love for Christ and love for the husband. And this I found very interesting, this one, because in some ways it is a life and the acceptance of an unhappy life, the wife's life, and this subordinate position within marriage. But it's also, it seems like a deep meditation on the connection between passion and suffering. And as you write here, this nun's love makes her reactive rather than active. And she's a very complex character. So I might get to introduce her and this section of the book, and I suppose all those elements of love and how they intersect here.
So other than national love, I actually figured that there's this the love for the Christ, for God, is also connecting these very diverse women. And one of them is this French Catholic nun, Saint Therese, who lived between 1873 and 1897. And she enters into dialogue with Saint John, just like Guan Sun did, but for very different reasons. And we have actually quotations from the autobiography of Saint Theresa. And this is also a very great narrative technique, again, that it's by quoting from her autobiography that she's once again telling us this 19th century history through the point of view of a woman who wrote an autobiography, actually. And in this autobiography, we read that how Saint Theresa says martyrdom was the dream of her youth, and she wants to be just like Saint John, for perhaps being executed, suffering, and calling the name of Jesus before dying. And she calls the names of other saints as well. So here that I read, there are so many this religious passion, but when I looked up the word passion, I realized that the passion and the word passive, they share the same root in Latin word for suffering, which is passio. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it was really interesting to me to see how passion and suffering are actually connected, how they're coming from the same word. So that's why here that the Saint Theresa, for the love for Jesus, that she wants to suffer, even die, and she says she wants to go through all these tortures inflicted upon the martyrs. So it's this religious love that was so fascinating. But then I realized that when Saint Theresa is calling the name of Saint John, who lived centuries ago, she overlooks Saint John's more ambivalent gender identity as an androgynous soldier, actually, because Saint Theresa evokes these saints, Saint Agnes and Saint Cecilia, who actually represent feminine virtue and virginity, but Saint John is nothing like that. That she again, she was of a more ambivalent, androgynous armed soldier. So that bringing those names together, they don't work, and so that's why that there is a difference. And also in Saint John, we don't see the theme of subordination, again, that we don't see it as well. So when that 19th century nun connects with Saint John from the 15th century, she actually overlooks the differences between them. While she glorifies the Saint John, she actually misunderstands, again, her more ambivalent gender identity here. But again, while connecting these two, the text is not glorifying religion either. It shows how women have been executed, how much they suffered because of this religious love, which is also dictated by our societies. But it's more actually questioning that dictate. That's why the title is Dictee, actually. But it's not promoting that religious love at all.
So on that question of religious love with the same character is an interesting point there. And I suppose you touched on it a little bit there as we'll lead into it. And that was the idea that she is standing up for, again, different ideas of femininity and female strength. And you write here that gender segregation, you write here about gender segregation in the Catholic Church. And then you quote the nun, and she says, I still cannot understand why women are so easily excommunicated in Italy. For every minute someone was saying, don't enter here, you'll be excommunicated. And yet they love God in such larger numbers than men do. And that was an interesting thought for me, this idea that this is such a novel about, I suppose, feminine strength and a reimagining of feminine quality. And yet, and from that, there is this character who many people may see as horribly oppressed and horribly suffering. And yet she is still a critic of the society around her at every moment.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. So that's why these historical characters are so complex, that they don't stand for only one single idea or ideology. And it's great that this text published in 1980s is evoking these names of women and the text that they have written, which most of us actually don't know. So it's through Saint Teresa's autobiography that the text talks about her love for Jesus, but at the same time, how she's very much critical of religion too. So, despite the Saint Teresa's unconditional love for Jesus, she laments how women are inferior in Christianity, and she says that women are like victims, actually, that there is a gender segregation, as you said, in Italian church, and there are all these spaces which are mostly predominantly for men. So and by saying this, by attacking the church actually in the 19th century, that Saint Teresa herself is very much challenging these traditional female roles of passivity and obedience by showing how women endured these insults of soldiers, actually, for women who tried to actually go to church and so on. So, but actually, Saint Therese believes that Jesus doesn't support the female oppression, that there's a quote where Saint Therese says, "In heaven, he will show that his thoughts are not man's thoughts," she writes. So I think she distinguishes between religion and the institutionalized form of religion. So it's the, let's say, the Italy or the church itself is making these rules of don't enter here and there, and how women are excommunicated in Italy for every minute. But it's the in a way the fault of the institution, the society, how it's in a way performing these religion, but not the religion itself, I think.
So let's move on to another aspect of that love. And you mentioned it briefly before, and this is one of those ones that comes through in the text with incredibly complex nature behind it. And you do a lot of work on it here in the article, and you speak about the love between mothers and daughters. And you write, as opposed to socially constructed love and as such as love for the nation, this is now love being represented as natural and biological. However, despite it all being universal, natural and biological, it's also played out as something that's always out of reach and never can be attained. So that sounds very complex. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, I mean, my reading of the text was in terms of, again, the love for the nation or for the Jesus, even for the husband are. It's an emotion that society expects you to perform. And even that there was another scene where this wife, unnamed wife, is an oppressed marriage. And actually, her silence is narrated in parallel with women who are silent in religion and so on. But I felt while I was reading the novel that, as opposed to these nationalist, religious, or patriarchal forms of love, that maternal love is represented something to be more natural or biological, I felt. And the reason I felt that way, that it's the text opens up with this the photograph of a Japanese prison wall with Korean writing saying, "Mother, I want to see you. I'm hungry. I want to go. I want to go home." And there are no captions. I mean, this is what I read in a source. So it's in a way starts with a note for a mother, and then the unnamed daughter, which evokes Teresa Cha herself, in a way describes this relationship with the mother as a life giver. And she says, "Mother, I dream you just to be able to see you. Mother, my first sound, my first concept." So this the idea of the first sound and first concept, in a way, suggests that it's something of a more natural relationship before you enter into learning the social dictates. which, according to both Julia Kristeva and Sigmund Freud and Lacan, they believe that this happens with the father. That, this is all very theoretical and philosophical, but Kristeva, for example, says that there's a pre-linguistic, pre-social period, which she calls the semiotic. And she says that in this period, in your early years, you connect with mother, and years after, actually, in the symbolic process, that the moment you enter into society, the moment you learn the language and the traditions, and then you become a social being and you learn those social dictates through language, which is also predominantly male shaped as well. So that's why they distinguish this semiotic versus the symbolic process. And then they believe there is a point where we're not yet open to society, and that comes with the language. So it's through language, let's say, we learn the concept of marriage, or it's through language we learn we are supposed to go to school or love the nation and so on. But without the language, the pre-linguistic period is, for these writers, is something more, in a way, more authentic, I would say, that it's more the first feelings that you have. And in the text, I felt that too, that and it's a dictee, again, the title Dictee, that it's all the dictates of either the education system or history or the language or oppression and so on. And somehow all these dictates, in a way, are related to patriarchal societies too, and how women have been the victims, perhaps. And that's why I think this, here at least, this mother and daughter relationship or love seems in a different level than the others, that it's not shown as something socially constructed, at least.
So that was going to be my next. That was going to be my next question, actually. Is there any sense in the text that maternal love aspect is superior in any way to the other aspects of love that we've touched on, or is it just different? Is there any way that the author elevates it in its importance, or is it just something that sits on a different spectrum, so to speak?
I think it's set in a different spectrum, that in the novel we get the sense that it is not something that you learn from your education system or religion or history books, that it's more instinctive, this maternal love, and it's set as something different than again what the society expects us to do. So that's why I feel it's in a different level, because in all the other themes, and there's a scene of a school that you go to the Catholic school, the French Catholic school, and this might also be autobiographical perhaps. You're told where to stand in line and hold the relic of Jesus or Virgin Mary, that there you're always told what to do. But this maternal love, again, as Kristeva says, you feel it, or the child's love for the mother, that you feel it at a time when you're not yet exposed to these social dictates. Nobody tells the baby to love the mother, but it's set as much more something natural, I think, as opposed to cultural. But even though it's set in a different way, it's much more elevated as being instinctive rather than a dictated emotion, that we also see that this is unattainable either, that let's say that there's not even a one dialogue between the mother and the daughter who evoke Cha and her mother herself, that there's only a one or two letter correspondence in the text, that they cannot communicate. And the daughter says to the mother in a letter, she says, I speak in another language now, that I speak in a foreign tongue, she writes from the US to China, that there is this huge distance between them, that the daughter is in the US and the mother, I believe, is in China. So there is so much of a lingual, cultural gap between them that they cannot connect. So even though it might be instinctual, it's not... they don't live happily ever after either. It's not, again, very much glorified, praised, and romanticized either. So it may not be dictated, but there is always a separation, a distance between mother and daughter figures in the text. And that's why in other fragments, we see references to the Demeter, the Greek goddess of harvest, and whose daughter Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld. So this the Demeter and Persephone is that there's always a mutual love, but separation, because again the daughter has to go back to Hades, the underworld again, for harvesting, agricultural growth, and natural cycle of seasons, that they cannot be connected, that there's always a separation between Demeter and Persephone as well. They cannot connect. So it's an instinctual love maybe, but it's not glorified as a source of happiness and bliss either.
I'm glad you brought in the story of Demeter and Persephone there, because it's a story that I knew quite well, and I thought always had a lot of depth to it, and the author brings it in really well here, and you do a lot of analysis on it. It's really important. And one of the things that you do write about it, that you say is a conscious effort in the book through the separation of Demeter and Persephone, and also between the mother and the daughter, who, as of course, separated from Korea and America, so to speak. And you say there is no attempt here to mend the broken bond between mother and daughter. It's one of those things that has to sit in a way it's through the disconnect is where the harmonious and the stability comes from. You're not going to get any closer here. So I want you to talk about that idea of not just that it's impossible to ever have that perfect reunification, but that the author doesn't even attempt to begin to start the process of mending those bonds, because that is exactly the way she designed it in some ways.
Definitely. So the author is not trying to mend any mother-daughter relationships. It's not promoting either patriotic love or religious love. That emotion itself has been, again, something that we learn and trained and in a way educated. And since it's also written in the 1980s, that there is not really belief in harmony, order, and symmetry anymore. And we get this feeling actually even after the World War I, even at the end of 19th century, that all those good old ideas of rationality, meaning, and possibility of a happier afterlife, and things can be harmonious and great, that it's actually totally gone, slowly and slowly. And as a writer, again, who went through multiple oppressions, living in multiple different languages, that again, it would not be, I believe, rational really, or meaningful to sustain that very much of a hope in this ideals of harmony and beauty that were described by Romantics or by the Enlightenment. So here too, the mother and daughter relationship might be different again, in the sense that it might be more instinctual. It's independent from male dictates, actually, just like the figure of Sappho and lesbian love, which is also mentioned in the text, would not be very much meaningful or realist to envision this harmony or beauty or symmetry, all those ideals that we read in the Romantics or in the Enlightenment, that they're actually gone. And as a writer, actually, actually, who went through these multiple different oppressions at the French Catholic school and her mother in Korea. It would be, I think, unrealistic to write a novel again with a beginning, middle, end, where all the characters come together, the mothers and daughters unite, and everybody loves each other. That it's too romantic. I think that we don't live in that world anymore, probably. So since these emotions are not idealized, since the novel shows how actually we are fragmented and so on, the text itself too is fragmented. It's very much broken, that we can't connect the ties. Just like we can never bring the mother and daughter together, we can't really bring together the fragments either in the text.
I want to bring in an element that you touched on briefly there, and that was we've been speaking, of course, about this maternal love and this relationship between mother and daughter. But this also has another element to it that you bring into your analysis here, and that is the idea of female lineage. And this is important, of course, because Korea, just as many societies, is quite patriarchal. The father's surname is passed down, the father's ancestry is passed down. But through Dictee, it is a book that you write, it imagines female lineage and female narratives and eliminates the patriarchs and the fathers and the husbands. So I might you to touch on that element of consciously building up the idea of maternal lineage.
Maternal lineage, female lineage, that again relates to causality. When we read history, and actually the whole causality of what leads to what is always narrated through white heterosexual privileged man's point of view. That's what we always read. And the text again breaks that patriarchal lineage by first, as I mentioned, connecting the Queen Min and Guan. Instead of talking about how they were killed and tortured, it talks about mostly what their achievements were, actually, how they fought against the Japanese. So, and by bringing in the Joan of Arc too, it connects all these women and sort of forms a historical lineage in that case. And it's also doing it from these mother and daughter narratives too. That again, that from the immigrants, we read the mother and daughter narrative, that it's a man-free zone in a way, and we see it through the Persephone and Demeter too. So writing mythology, talking about mythology again through perhaps female characters, and that's the text also ends with a reference to a Korean myth, I believe, and there is this young girl who wants to take medicine to her mother, and she goes home actually as fast as she can to take the medicine to her mother, but there is a paper screen door that stands between the daughter and mother, and there's a candle light. But again, she goes there, but we don't see that girl entering the door, entering the house. So there's that impossibility of a mother and daughter union there too. There is a desire for it, but impossibility for unity. But still, all these stories and fragments actually try to form a matrilinear lineage that is perhaps free from, again, male-dominated history or religion and, the nationalist narratives. Even another example to that would be that the novel is divided into 9 chapters, and each chapter is recited from a Greek muse. So we see the list of these Greek muses in the beginning, and then let's say we see the chapter Clio, the history chapter, and the history chapter brings out the voices of women like Joan of Arc and Guan. And we see the epic chapter, which again, instead of glorifying male achievements, it brings out the mother and daughter and how they survived colonialism. So even the text is structured through these muses, the Greek muses, who tell those stories. But again, even though there's a matrilinear lineage, even though the text is connecting these multiple women from diverse cultures and centuries, the text is not glorifying these women either. It is not falling into the trap of idealizing women while attacking the social dictates. I think it's the most important part of the text, and it is so hard to do it as well, that none of these characters are glorified.
So you mentioned there a couple of questions ago, you introduced the Greek lesbian poet Sappho, and this idea of course, love again, but non-heterosexual love. And this, of course, is an interesting element that the author introduced here. But she introduces it also at the very beginning of the text, and this is how it all begins. I wonder why you think it begins in that way, because it is a wonderfully thoughtful piece of literary device to start a text which is so creative and so thought-provoking and so challenging to all these ideas of love, to start in just this way. So I might get to touch on that element again, and why the literary choice was done at the very beginning of the text.
Sure. So since the whole text again is bringing out women's voices to tell history, religion, mythology, all the discourses we have read, mostly from the male perspective, to break that actually patriarchal structure, she starts with female voices. And when we read Sappho's quote, and she says, "May I write words?" That's how she starts. More naked than flesh, stronger than bone, actually, more sensitive than nerve. Even the way she starts the quote, "May I write?" in a way, it's asking the permission. May I write? Because the writing subject, again, has always been men, starting from the 16th century, that the public voice has been. But of course, when I say men, I'm referring to white heterosexual privileged men, not the poor or the homosexual or the slave at all. So she's asking for a permission. Even from the beginning, it highlights the idea of women's inability to speak, of how they're not heard, and also that the language that she uses, Sappho, is about, again, there is an emphasis on human nature, and she talks about this emotion that cannot be defined by social categories, that she uses words like bone, flesh, and nerve. Actually, it's a very interesting, different language. So that is not really much informed by social, moralistic, religious dictates, but an alternative literary tradition that she actually offers in the beginning. And this, even "May I write words?" also reminds us of Virginia Woolf's text, "A Room of One's Own," in which she says that what if Shakespeare had a genius sister, Judith? What would happen to her in the 16th century? And Virginia Woolf's response is, again, because women did not have education, she would probably sit at home and do domestic work, that she would not have chance to write or act at all. So that Sappho's words are bringing out that voice. And I think it also suggests that maybe nothing has much changed, perhaps since the time of Sappho saying, "May I write words?" to Virginia Woolf writing in early 20th century, and perhaps to 1980s, that there is a very much of a connection between these multiple centuries, and it very questions the progress. I think that there's nothing really different.
So as a final question here, I think I might get a look back on the text. So the text, as you mentioned, Dictee, was written in 1982, and your analysis of it was done in 2014, so a few years ago as well. But I wonder how you view the text now, looking back on it. It's such a complex text, as you mentioned, in so many different ways. I wonder if, looking back on it, you've changed any of your views, or it's sunk in different ways, because as I had a brief read through it myself, it's one of those things that you think to yourself, this needs another read and another read and another read, and imagine it would change its dimensions each time you look at it. So I wonder, I suppose, two questions: how you look back on the text now after a few years of doing this analysis, and how we all should begin to understand this text Dictee and its place in history.
Well, actually, I also teach this text in my classes on contemporary fiction or postmodern fiction. I often teach it, so I have a chance to look back and rethink about the text from my students' perspectives as well. And it's such a fragmented and complicated text that every time I teach it, I have very different ideas. And for example, there's a line that, in a way, accuses more of Western readers, I think, by saying that all these ideas of, let's say, Korean War or Japanese occupation of Korea, that Western readers would be distant to these themes, that they wouldn't actually care, that this is such a distant idea that one of the narrators complains. And when I was teaching this course, that I asked the question to my students, do you feel distant to that as well? And one student said, yes, that she feels distant to all this Korean history. And ironically, actually, Turkey was a part of the Korean War. But many actually don't know that. But many other students, though, actually responded that they don't feel very distant, because all these themes of repression and violence and immigration, they're actually very much happening right now. Actually, both in Turkey and many other countries too, that we are actually going through that we have the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and it's not something that happened only in 1982, but these issues are still going on today. So there are multiple topics to write about, and actually, the more I read about it, and I went to Korea after writing this article. I was so interested in visiting Seoul, and I went to the prison of Gwansun where she stayed in. I went to the museum, so I followed the steps of Gwansun in Seoul in the museums. And I went to the Korean War Museum, and it made me think more about Turkey's involvement in Korea. So going to Korea and thinking about this text made me think of another Turkish author's text. And I actually recently wrote about depictions of Korean War and the massacres in Turkey in the East region, and how they connect in Turkish authors' texts. So I did not write about Cha again, but still thinking about Cha and going back to Korea made me think more about the Korean War and Turkey's involvement and how the literary response was. So I still look back, I still engage with it, and I think more about it. And you can write about the photographs, these uncaptioned pictures, or there are so many things to write about, I would say. And your second question, how we understand the text, and I believe even the title, Dictee, how we live under the dictates, is, I believe it's a very universal theme. And it shows how the nature of dictates change, but the dictate itself has not changed. And one great example is in the beginning, we have these French grammar exercises in the text. So first the reader wonders, why would we skip from Sappho to Greek muses and to the French grammar exercises? The exercises tell us, translate this and that, rewrite this and that. They're all in French. But then it actually makes you think even how learning a foreign language is a dictee. And let's say how we're all supposed to be learning English, or if you know English, you need to know another language, and that should be, French or German, or I don't know. But even what we learn, the language we choose to learn, or the school we go to, is very social and political. And again, the scene of the school where everybody gets in line and, to perform these religious rituals it again shows how we live, we follow, perform all these dictates. And so whatever we do, whether it's the language we study or the history book that we read, and everything is very much ideological and political. And that's maybe how we should understand the text, and how it points out suppression and silence in many communities. And because in many chapters, there's this she speaking, but we don't know the age, ethnicity, or name of that she. So it can be anyone again, in Korea or Turkey or in Africa or in Italy, that it's not mentioned. So that's why the themes are, I believe, very much universal. So that's how we can maybe, I would say, look at the text, feel the text, because it's not traditional reading where you follow a story, where there's a beginning, middle, end, and where you are happy with a certain ending. So it's not about really, I believe, understanding the text, but it's about feeling how it feels not to be able to speak or to exist, and how it feels not to have any maybe free will or independence, I would say.
So that's a wonderfully thoughtful note to leave the podcast on. Underneath the podcast in the description, I'm going to link Theresa Kyung Cha's book, Dictee, that we've been speaking about today. And of course, I'm also going to link Naz's article, Love as a Contact Zone. So I do encourage people to go and read them both for themselves. There's a lot of detail in there that we didn't get to today, and incredibly thought-provoking book and an incredibly thought-provoking article. On that, Naz Bulamur, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very nice to meet you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Career Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.